All cells need ATP. That means that all cells need cell energy. How do we get our cell energy? We get our energy from eating our food. But how is it that we can release cell energy from something as simple as sugar? Well, let's think about the other set of reactions that we've been talking about. Previously, when we talked about photosynthesis, we noted that carbon dioxide and water were put together with the energy of the sun to make glucose. That sun energy was actually stored in that glucose molecule, which means that when I eat that glucose molecule, that I can unharness the energy that was stored inside of it if I do it correctly. But it's not just me, and it's not just you, and it's not just animals. Every organism on this planet needs to make ATP so that its cells can continue to function. That means that every organism on this planet does some form of cellular respiration. There are two major types of respiration. There's aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is when you do cellular respiration in the presence of oxygen. In anaerobic respiration, that's when organisms perform cellular respiration without oxygen. There are three major steps in aerobic respiration, and since that's the type of respiration that most eukaryotic cells do, let's talk about aerobic respiration first. Aerobic respiration happens both in plants and animals and happens in three steps. The first step is the breaking down of glucose, called glycolysis. The second step is when the products from glycolysis are further broken down in the Krebs cycle, where each carbon is removed and its electrons are stripped off. The last part of the process is called the electron transport chain, or the ETC. And we have seen the electron transport chain before in photosynthesis, so we know that the electron transport chain pumps protons across a membrane, allowing for the proton motive force to make ATP using ATP synthase. Now I know that that sounded a little bit confusing, a lot of funky words, so let's go through the processes step at a time. The first step, glycolysis, is when a large 6-carbon glucose molecule enters the cell and it's in the cytoplasm of the cell. In this case, 2 ATP are used to start the process, and then 4 ATP are released in the process, which means that if I invest 2 ATP and I get 4 back, my actual profit is only 2 ATP, which is good. I mean, it's ATP, but it's not enough to run or to walk or to do any intense exercise as an animal. So we've got to have something better to give us a little bit more energy. The other thing that's produced in glycolysis is the product of 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So when that glucose is cut in half, not only does it release some of the energy stored in those bonds as ATP, it also leaves behind the 2 products. Those 3-carbon pyruvates are actually the pieces of the glucose that will move on to get further broken down. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was our final product, which is 2NADH. Now we talked about an electron carrier called NADPH, but now we're going to be dealing with NADH. NADH is just like the other electron carrier in that it takes the excited high energy electrons and chaperones them from one part of a cell to another. The high energy electrons in respiration are always dropped off at the electron transport chain so they can more effectively make a greater amount of ATP. So let's quickly review. Glycolysis. 1 glucose is broken into 2 smaller pyruvates. In the process, 2 net ATP are produced and 2 high energy electron carriers are also produced. As we move out of the cytoplasm and into the Krebs cycle, the pyruvates are further broken down. Every one of those carbons, all 6 carbons, are stripped off and released as CO2. During the Krebs cycle, each spin of the cycle releases more carbon dioxide. It also releases a little bit of the energy stored in those bonds as ATP, but it only makes 2 ATP. The big thing that happens in the Krebs cycle is that it strips out the high energy electrons that were stored in the glucose originally when the plant made the glucose molecule. Remember those excited electrons that went in? Well, now we're pulling them back out. So we pull out those excited electrons, and we know that we have to have chaperones chaperone them over to the electron transport chain. Well, inside the mitochondria, there's not just more NADH. There's also another electron carrier called FADH2. I consider FADH2 like NADH's ugly cousin. It's not very effective, and it doesn't carry the electrons as well as the NADH does. So, what ends up happening is those high energy molecules from the Krebs cycle are now going to move on to the next process. So let's review the Krebs cycle. Where does it happen? It's in the mitochondria. What happens? It pulls the carbons off the original glucose molecule, strips off their high energy electrons, and leaves them with the 2 chaperones, NADH and FADH2. 2 ATP are also produced, but 2 ATP still just isn't enough. Now remember, I said that glycolysis made 2 ATP and the Krebs cycle made 2 ATP, but that just wasn't enough. The electron transport chain is able to make a huge amount of ATP because it uses the enzyme ATP synthase. I liken it to if you were trying to produce toy horses and you had workers come in and they put on the head and then they added the feet and then they added the tail. You could produce a bunch of horses, and that's good. But what if you had a toy factory? You could make thousands of toy horses in a day. Well, it's the same thing with ATP synthase. If you individually add the phosphate to the ADP to make ATP, well, you made ATP, and that's good. But what if you could do that in a factory? What if you could have a machine that could actually produce thousands of ATP in a minute? Well, ATP synthase is that machine. But how are you going to power that machine? If you remember correctly, ATP synthase works off of proton power. So those electrons are released at the top of the electron transport chain. And as they slide down the chain, or slide down those proteins, they give off their energy and run the proton pumps that pump protons into the space inside the mitochondria. That inner membrane space fills up with protons and fills up with protons and fills up with protons until it opens the dam in the ATP synthase and the protons flow through, turning the crank on the ATP synthase so the ATP synthase can generate 32 to 34 ATP with just the electrons from one glucose. This is happening all over the inner membrane within the mitochondria. So thousands of ATP are being produced in a second. What happens, though, to the electrons when they're at the bottom of the slide? If they just sat there, it'd be like that kid on the playground who rests at the bottom of the slide, and then you try to go down, and now you're stuck on the slide, and then your brother or sister tries to go down behind you, and then they're stuck on the slide, and eventually the whole slide is backed up, right? So we have to have somebody at the bottom of the electron transport chain to pick up the electrons and pull them away and move them out of the mitochondria so we don't have to worry about them anymore. Oxygen is what we breathe in, and when we breathe in the oxygen, it goes into your mitochondria and it grabs up those electrons. Oxygen loves some electrons. And it uses a couple of protons, and together with hydrogen and oxygen and a couple of electrons, it makes water. And the water leaves the mitochondria and is used in other processes in the cell. So, what exactly happens in cellular respiration? Let's remember. In glycolysis, glucose was cut in half and released 2 ATP. In the Krebs cycle, all of the carbon were removed to produce 2 ATP, but more importantly, to produce high-energy electron carriers. Those high-energy electron carriers run the electron transport chain and, therefore, power ATP synthase. ATP synthase makes 32 to 34 ATP. I like to use the lower value just to be safe. So on the quiz, I would say it produces 36 ATP in the presence of oxygen. Oxygen was important because it kept the electron transport chain functioning at maximum efficiency. So let's go over what we've learned recently. We learned that cells need cell energy, and cell energy are types of energy that are renewable, they're rechargeable. ATP can be recharged by adding a phosphate to ADP, and our high-energy electron carriers can go and pick up more high-energy electrons once they're done dropping off the electrons where they need to go. In photosynthesis, sunlight energy was harnessed into cellular energy, or harnessed into high-energy molecules. Those high-energy molecules aren't very stable. So the plant turns those high-energy molecules into sugar using carbon dioxide. Then, when either the plant is ready to break down the sugar or animals are ready to break down the sugar, they release the energy that was stored in those glucose bonds and turn it back into cell energy, which is accepted everywhere in the cell. Okay, so now we know how organisms break down their glucose with plenty of oxygen. But what happens when you're working out really hard and you deplete your muscles of oxygen? Or what happens to other organisms when they're in a non-oxygen environment? Well, in that case, organisms use anaerobic respiration. And in anaerobic respiration, pyruvates are further broken down into all sorts of different products. But the same thing with every time this process happens is that it is someplace for the electron carriers to drop off their high energy electrons so they can come back and pick up more high energy electrons as glucose is broken down in glycolysis. Now remember, glycolysis was the process that broke down glucose into pyruvates. And in that process, 2 net ATP were made. And like I said, 2 net ATP, it's ATP, but it's not a lot. However, if you're desperate for cell energy, and this is your only option, you're going to take it. So in some bacteria, they could use it to ferment, for instance, soy, to make soy sauce. Lactobacillus ferments lactose to make cheese and cheese curds. A lot of different yeasts and bacteria will use it to make alcohol in the fermentation process. Yeast ferments sugar to make bread or help bread rise. And animals, we also do fermentation. When we work out really hard, we start to build up lactic acid because those pyruvates are turned into lactic acid, which we then later have to flush from our system. But it's better than not having any cell energy at all. Remember, every organism on this planet needs cell energy in order to move, to function, and to carry out all of the characteristics of life.